Well, good morning and welcome members to the 14th meeting in 2014 of the Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee. We have apologies from Margaret McCulloch, and in her place I welcome back Mary Fee. And as always, ask members to switch off any mobile phones, please. Agenda item 1 is a decision on taking business in private. It's proposed that the committee takes items 3 and 4 in private. Item 3 is consideration of the committee's draft report on the Historic Environment Scotland Bill, and item 4 is consideration of the evidence we are about to take from the Minister for parliamentary business. Does the committee agree to take items 3 and 4 in private, please? We do. Thank you very much. That gives me a great pleasure to welcome Joe Fitzpatrick, the Minister for Parliamentary Business, to Stephen McGregor and to Paul Coquette, who are here to assist him in giving us good answers, I hope, which I think is what it's all about. And I'd like to start by simply noting that the committee's report on instruments considered in 2012-13 noted a reduction in the percentage of instruments reported from previous reporting periods. Furthermore, the committee's most recent quarterly reports reflect the relatively low number of instruments reported by the committee to date in the current period. And of course, the committee welcomes those figures. I'd like to ask the Minister what steps the Scottish Government is taking to maintain this improvement and, indeed, if possible, to reduce the number of reported instruments still further.
Well, first of all, thanks very much for inviting me along today. It's I appreciate the opportunity to come and speak to the committee and to discuss your annual report and other matters. We're obviously very pleased that with the committee's annual report that you see the progress that we have made in improving our instruments. And like you say, something we have to continue to do, something we have to not let up on, so to speak. But I would put on record that my view that the relationship that we've developed between the committee and the government is crucial to how we are managing to make, I think, sustained progress in improving the robustness of instruments and reducing the number of times that you have to report to us. We very much value your input into the process and see it as part of the process. I think I have come to the point of viewing we can either, when something's reported, it's either a conflict and we have to try and be defensive on that, or we can say, well, that's good, you've done your role in the process, now let's see how we can make sure that mistake or that issue doesn't arise again. And that's the relationship I think we've started to develop, and I think we would continue to do that. So our officials are regularly liaising with your clerks, and the government's legal advisors are regularly liaising with your legal advisors, and that's something that we would want to continue doing, and to make sure that that's instilled in the process going forward. In practical terms, there's a few things that process has developed, and improvements of, I think, the systems that we have in place. So, for instance, we have now detailed guidance for drafters in terms of drafting SSIs, and that's been developed in liaison with yourselves and with your clerks and your legal advisors, to the point that where we have training events for drafters that on the issue of, for instance, transitional provisions, an issue that was raised by yourselves. So we've then gone forward and make sure there's training to deal with that issue, and always in partnership with your side, with yourselves. So it's about hearing what you're saying and then finding ways to enshrine that in the guidance that we give to our drafters and our policy teams. I think part of what we're trying to do is to get policy teams to understand what it is that you do as a committee, and what you're about, and so that they then take ownership of the quality of their instruments and the delegated powers that associate their bills.
Certainly from this side of the table, I see a developing relationship, and I can reflect what you've just said to us, of a desire simply to get it right between us, and not to be confrontational if we can sensibly avoid it. So thank you very much indeed. I think transitional instruments is something we probably will return to later, but for the moment, can I bring in Mary Fee, please?
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Minister. Prior to recess, there tends to be a sharp rise in the number of instruments laid before Parliament, and this can have an impact on the level of scrutiny that can realistically be carried out by committee. What action is the Government taking to ensure that such peaks in the volume of SSIs laid are avoided as far as possible, and particularly in light of the change to and the unusual recess periods this summer?
Okay. Obviously, it's not possible to manage the volume of SSIs in the same way as we manage to do for bills, and some come in packages which by definition the package is large, so therefore it provides a peak. But we do try our best to manage that over the period, so that there aren't significant peaks. I don't think we're expecting any major peaks going forward. One of the processes that we've put in place is, as well as having a weekly review of SSIs coming forward, we have a much longer view of the horizon, which we share with your clerk, so that we can identify where it does look like there's a potential for a peak and try and manage that, both in terms of the committee's ability to manage your time, but also to see whether we can level that out over the piece. Peaks can occur for a number of reasons. The kind of obvious ones are because instruments need to come into force for the 1st of January or the 1st of April. But you're right that there is a potential peak prior to the long recesses, particularly that long summer recess. So I think actually the fact that the recess period is not quite as long before we come back for another period might help reduce that demand to get instruments through just before the end of the summer recess. So hopefully that will actually help this year in terms of levelling out the workload that we have.
A bit more smoothly.
I think, you know, as I say, we can't manage it in the same way as we manage to manage the legislation in terms of bills, but I think we're not expecting any major peaks this year, and I think that is an area that we need to look at how we can use that 3-week period as part of that process.
Thank you. As you'll be aware, a negative SSI which has been brought into force fewer than 28 days after it was laid is automatically reported by the committee for breaching the 28-day rule. And recently, a number of instruments which implement UK-wide policy were reported under the 28-day rule. And the committee does note that in such cases, the reasons for the breach cited by the government have included the requirement to wait until the UK government has laid an instrument in similar terms in the UK Parliament, or that liaison with the UK government has otherwise delayed the date of laying. What work is the government undertaking to ensure better coordination with the UK legislators in order to avoid such breaches in the future?
First of all, can I say we take these timings very, very seriously, which I think is shown by the figures. I think something like 38 cases of this breach has occurred since 2011, so about 3%. So a relatively small number, which I think shows that it's not something we treat lightly, the fact that we're going to breach the 28 days. However, as you say, one of the reasons that there have been breaches is where we're trying to work, where we're having to work with other administrations. I think we're the only administration that has a 28-day period. Other administrations, UK Government, Welsh Assembly and Northern Ireland, all have 28 days.
We have 21 days.
Northern Ireland's
no, we have 21 days.
Yes, yeah, sorry. They have the 21 days, sorry. Getting the wrong way around. So we constantly try and make sure that the UK Government and the other administrations are aware of our different timings as part of that process, and sometimes we manage and sometimes we don't, but we constantly make the point that our timings, you know, as laid down, are 28 days. We also try and make the point about our different recess times, which often cause a conflict in terms of when the UK Government are trying to pull something forward. They think recess is later than it is here in Scotland, so the timings are squeezed. So we try and continue to have that dialogue. It's something I raise frequently with David Mundell, the Parliamentary Under Secretary in the Scotland office, and I know that's something that he again in turn tries to flag up to UK Government departments in particular when they're driving this forward. I do think it's helpful that you raise this point with us, because it means that it's another, you know, I can make the point that I'm being pressed by this committee, that, you know, these are important. The 28 days it's in our standing orders. It's something that we think is important. So it's helpful that you are continuing to press the case.
Minister, the 28-day figure, given that it's 21 in other jurisdictions, and given that it's sometimes the fault of the UK government and sometimes the fault of the Scottish government that this rule is breached, is there any merit in considering extending that figure, given recesses elsewhere that can impact on our Parliament here? Or is this, given the 28-day figure is an arbitrary figure, I mean, is there an opportunity for considering a different one, or not? Or would it be sensible or not so to do?
I mean, I think we have the 28-day figure, and the Parliament had come to terms that was the correct time for a negative instrument here. It's obviously not really for us to tell other parliaments that they should change their 21 days. However, if an instrument has to be laid in Scotland at the same time it does in the UK, clearly 28 days doesn't breach the UK government's 28-day figure. So they could comply with their timings by complying with ours, and that's the kind of case that I would tend to make. However, sometimes the driver is even further away, and it's European legislation, so the dates that are required are even tighter. But it's something that we stress at every opportunity, that if we're trying to work together on something, there's a reason for an order needing to come in force in Scotland at the same time as it does in other authorities' jurisdictions, then we would be hopeful that they'd always be mindful of our different timings. And as I say, it's something that I have raised and will raise again with Mr Mundell.
Morning, Minister. Just in terms of this issue of the recess dates, is that the main reason for some of the slippage with the laying of the SSIs, or the draft SSIs? Is that the main reason? With the difference of recess dates between the different?
Well, the unusual recess dates for this year actually provides an opportunity for spreading, evening stuff out more.
Not so much something for also what's coming ahead, but in terms of you mentioned about the 3% figure, and so in terms of that 3%, is the issue of the recess dates, is that the main driver for the reason why some are delayed?
Well, I mean, there's kind of two main reasons why we wouldn't make the 28-day period. So one is because of the different times with the UK. So that could be because of our recess, but it's more normally, I think, because they work to the 21-day period and we work to 28 days. And it's about making sure that, while Mr Mundell and his office are very aware of the differences, that message has got down to the different departments in UK government and other administrations. The other reason, of course, where we might be in breach is because we've laid an order within the 28 days, and then either this committee or another committee has made comments which we've taken on board, and then either withdrawn and relayed, or we've laid an amendment order. And so clearly, if there's a coming into force date, which was the 28 day from the first laying, then that becomes impossible to meet that time. But I guess I hope that Parliament would see that as us working with Parliament to improve the instruments that we're doing, and the kind of process had started earlier. And I think normally we do, our reasons are accepted by the committee in most cases.
It's worth saying, if I might butt in at that point, that actually we do have a different column for the 28-day rule breaches for precisely that reason. Right. So we now see them statistically being different. Okay. Of course, the Parliament stats won't say that, but internally we understand the point. Thank you very much. Okay, I think we then turn to Richard Baker, please.
Thank you. Morning, Minister. As you know, in our report on instruments considered in 2012 to 13, one of the issues we raised was the packages of instruments in terms of grouping and quality, specifically in relation to the Police and Fire Reform Scotland Act. And we highlighted concerns there in relation to the high number of instruments reported upon and the volume of instruments laid within a 2-month period, which we considered negatively impacted on the Parliament's ability to scrutinise the instruments. Can you highlight any steps the government's taking to ensure that the matters raised in our report are taken into consideration in the future when you are laying packages of instruments?
Okay, obviously, the Fire and Police and Fire Reform Act was a big act with some substantial amount of instruments attached, and a very large and very complex package. And it was a package that we dealt with and communicated with the committee as a package. In the main, I think that the process was a good process, but it did highlight, as you say, some issues that we have taken forward in terms of improving the process going on. So I think one of the things was the quality of policy notes. I think you highlighted was something that you felt would help you, and that's something that we've put in place, more details, guidance about what should be contained in the policy notes. And again, that's something that we've developed in liaison with the committee and with your clerk and legal advisors. We've also note the point that you made in the report about instruments which referred to instruments which were coming in a later group, and that's something which there was quite a lot of that within that bill, and it's clearly something taken on board your point that we should try to avoid wherever possible. Sometimes it will be such that, you know, if there's a large number of packages, a large number of instruments where the substantive instruments maybe come into 2 packages and there's a small cross-reference, it will be unavoidable not to have any cross-reference. But I think we need to work to try and reduce that wherever possible. And I think the other thing is to make sure that the committee is aware of these at the earliest possible stage. So one of the things that we have done is instigated a series of implementation meetings with officials and your clerks. And hopefully that helps give an understanding of how a package fits together and where there is potentially these cross-references. There are future implementation packages coming forward, and the Marriage and Civil Partnership Bill, for instance, will have a number of complex instruments associated with it, which we'll definitely be making sure we work very closely with the clerks so that you have an understanding as early as possible of how they all interact going forward. One of the things that I think the big things that we've learned is that these implementation meetings, I think, are helpful, and I would be proposing that we try to do that wherever practicable for the majority of bills where there are delegated powers. So not just for the big bills. So even if there's not these great big packages, there's a benefit of the committee at the earliest stage having an understanding of how instruments within a bill will interact.
So when it comes to legislation, we can expect a smoother process.
I think lessons have definitely been learned, and we're trying to implement those lessons, working in partnership with your clerk and your legal advisors.
Thank you, Minister. Sorry.
I cannot but think, though, that there may be problems in future, and not with this committee or this term of Parliament, but the cross-referencing to which you refer does make it perfectly legitimate for a committee to turn around and say, well, we can't pass this because we quite literally and legally don't know what it refers to, and that's understood. In a Parliament that in the future that might not be quite as consensual as this one, where there could be political obstruction, and I'm thinking to say well ahead, you could then finish up in a position where a committee will actually say, well, how could we defend this? Because we quite literally don't know what it means. So there may be some mileage, I'm thinking and suggesting, that developing a protocol yourselves in such a way that can be avoided.
I'll bring Mr. Kakette in a second. I think the point would be that sometimes if there was any cross-references, if you were to pull them all into one package, then you might not like the size of the package that you're being asked to deal with in one go, and it might be unwieldy for the committee. But Paul, do you want to?
I would certainly agree that where there's a high level of cross-referencing, then that makes it quite difficult to disentangle the package, because the committee would be being expected to look at some aspects when they don't know what's going to come later on. The cross-referencing won't work. The police and fire reform package did have quite a lot of cross-referencing as it happened, and not all packages necessarily have that degree of cross-referencing. So I think we need to make sure that that's all packaged together. But the point I think that came from that process is the need to be thoughtful and sensible in terms of the impact of these packages on the committee and on the scrutiny process. And for example, the upcoming implementation on same-sex marriage will certainly be one in which we can look closely at whether a kind of staging process, even if coming to 4 states might be the same, whether a kind of degree of better packaging of the measures that come forward in their final form would assist from that point of view. And it's a valid point, and it must help the committee to see those groupings of packaging together, even if, as you say, in cross-referencing cases, they can't be completely disentangled.
Thank you very much. I think we've left. Sorry, Richard. Please do. Sorry. Okay.
So my next question, Minister, is on the issue of consolidating instruments, which we also raised in our report. Now, the committee is of the view that legislation should be as clear and accessible as possible to the end user, and that subordinate legislation, which has been amended multiple times, should, therefore, where possible, be consolidated in order to provide a clear, up-to-date version of the legislation. So while we'd like to see as many instruments as possible consolidated, we're equally of the view that particular care should be taken to ensure that the end product is accurate and doesn't undermine the purpose of the consolidation in the first place. We understand the consolidation of instruments as a resource-intensive exercise. So can you tell us how the Scottish Government balances the need to consolidate instruments accurately with the resource pressures that creates?
Two very good points there. Firstly, that obviously we all want to make legislation as clear as possible for the end user, whoever that might be, and secondly, that we do have to balance how resources are used across the organisation. In the last year, we took forward 7 consolidations as part of that process, and so far this year, we've already taken forward 8. And we're continuing to look at other opportunities for consolidation. In determining where a consolidation is appropriate, we look at a number of things. So reviews of policy, changes in underpinning the primary legislation, feedback from this committee, and these are all things that we look at when determining where there's an opportunity to consolidate. One of the things I think is important when looking at, is this legislation clear and does it need consolidated in order to make it clearer, is who uses the instrument. Is it being read by legal professionals on a very occasional basis, or is it something that members of the public are using on a daily basis? And clearly there's a difference in terms of if it's been something that members of the public have to understand, then it has to be clear, and so that would obviously move up a step in terms of being prioritised. But you can be sure that when you've flagged up an area for consideration for consolidation, that is very much part of our process, and to look into that and to see whether there's an opportunity to deal with that issue.
I wonder, Minister, if you might consider an approach to the amendment of lists that are a regular feature of secondary legislation. And if you were, instead of to amend a list by substitution, deletion, addition, always ensure that the secondary instrument simply republished the list as a total, it would greatly simplify understanding, and of course, in a very key area of secondary legislation, probably prevent the need for substantial future consolidation effort and all that's implied in that. Is that something that's part of the thinking of officials as they draw up secondary legislation?
It does depend a bit on the circumstance. A short list might be one where it would be sensible if there was two changes out of 5, for example, in a list. You might substitute the full list. If it's very lengthy, then there may be less advantage in republishing the full list. But all of these options are considered when drafting techniques are used and considered as to the best way forward. The one thing we'd have to be clear about is if we republish a list, to make it clear to the Parliament where the changes are, because simply a new list, especially a long one, would obviously it wouldn't be immediately obvious what the changes are. But it's certainly the idea of looking at kind of the republication of full lists is certainly something. If lengthy lists, we don't tend to adopt that as a practice. But
merely say to you, when the list is lengthy, for the reader, the advantage is greater. Yeah. I understand, however, just to give a sense of balance as to where I'm coming from, that of course, when you put an entire list into an update, you open up in the consultation process, matters that you might wish otherwise to leave closed, and I absolutely understand that. But given that some lists, it is necessary to look through over a dozen updates, and it's not always easy to work out what these are. If you wish to work out what the list looks like, it would just simply seem a matter of good practice that as a norm, that one republished lists rather than updating them by a whole series of updates.
Sense in that, something I'll certainly take back. So, somebody a number of years ago mentioned that there was some, I can't even remember the context of what it was, where the schedule of an SI is taken, I think it was is in workplaces and pinned up for on the wall, and obviously a reissued version of that in that sort of example would be much more beneficial to the user if that's how it's used in practical terms in the real world. So examples of that would be a good example of where that would make sense. I can certainly take that back.
Thank you. I welcome the fact that you have 7 consolidations last year and you're in the process of doing 8 this year. How many pieces of legislation are there that are needing this? Is it tens? Is it hundreds? And what criteria do you use? And I'm not asking just a ballpark figure, an impression, but we feel as if there is quite a lot of legislation that needs consolidating. And I congratulate you. I honestly didn't know that this many were being addressed.
8 so far, and we do expect to take more forward, and maybe while I don't know, Paul might be able to give you some numbers, but I do expect some of the areas that the committee have flagged up to be addressed within this year as well. So some of the areas where you've said that these instruments need consolidation are areas that we're looking at bringing something forward within this year.
Stuart.
Just to give a good example, the 1491 Act, Common Good Act, which has been substantially amended, not least by an act in 1911. Nonetheless, there's still 3 lines of the 1491 Act that are still active. And really, it would be modestly useful to have drawn that forward into modern legislation, not least because the phraseology of the 1491 Act is in a very old form of Scots that requires, a little bit of effort. So I just give that as an example.
I have to administer that. I would, of course, provide students with the opportunity to point out in the future, but nonetheless, I think the point is fair made. Stuart McMillan, please.
Thank you. The committee has taken a strong interest in the transitional provisions contained in statutory instruments. In light of the recent examples where the Government and Parliament have not got these provisions right, the committee agreed with the Government a series of measures to seek to avoid any future such instances. While the Government has made these commitments, they are not prescribed, and as such future administrations do not necessarily need to observe them. The committee is therefore of the view that provision should be made for these commitments in standing orders. Is this something that the Scottish Government would be amenable to?
Certainly something that I think we need to consider, but we need to consider it carefully. For instance, how would we define what a complex transitional provision was? And so these are challenges that I think we need to address and consider. That said, I think progress has been made. The 2 cases which the committee are aware of were very serious, and these are very unusual circumstances that these cases came about. But it did instigate a process whereby we now take steps to ensure that there are 40 days before the instruments come into force in order to allow a greater degree of scrutiny. We've also made sure that there's an executive note attached to commencement orders, and also that complex transitional saving provisions have a policy note so that folk can understand the intent and purpose and for all but the simplest SSIs. But While it's very unusual, these are important important matters with big consequences when it goes wrong. So that's why there has been a degree of work with Paul Coquette and your legal advisor, who I think was Judith Morrison at the time. And maybe, Paul, do you want to just talk about the process that you went through?
Well, certainly I would very much endorse the sentiment that we've got common interest, clearly, in particular in commencement orders, because once you get to a commencement, the appointed date, it's much harder to sort things out afterwards, more even than kind of the more normal run-of-the-mill instruments. And I think that's absolutely right. There are various procedures and processes that are in place to try to minimise the risks of a difficulty arising, one of which is the scrutiny processes that are undertaken. The others are constant updates on the advice and support we give to our drafters in that respect, and we have specifically undertaken training on commencement and transitional provisions within the legal directorate. We did it last year. We're planning on running that again this year. So all these things are designed to ensure that the risk of these difficulties is minimised. What we have just now is the informal procedure that we know, where we aspire to the 40 days where we possibly can, in order to maximise the scrutiny opportunity, so that if problems do arise, we can sort those out before you get to the appointed date. There's different arguments as to whether embedding that in standing orders would be beneficial. I certainly take the point that, well, technically the understanding wouldn't bind future administrations. There might be some arguments about how easy it is to define complex in these circumstances when that would arise, and whether it's beneficial to have a kind of relatively formal standing orders requirement, where actually the kind of consensual working together through the processes we have in place may be as good or a better way to resolve these issues. But it's certainly worth considering, and it's something we touched on before at the initial discussions that the Minister referred to, but those were a little while ago, and certainly there may be some sense in revisiting that and seeing how experience has gone through with the more recent provisions. Fortunately, there haven't been the examples in terms of more recent legislation where those issues have arisen, but we mustn't be complacent, and we must continue to ensure that we work together in a sensible way. I'm not wholly sure whether standing order, but again, it's one of the issues I'd certainly like to take forward in my discussions with the person who will be taking over from Judith and advising the committee.
General discussion. I'm conscious in the process, of course, the convener of the Standing Orders Committee, or Standards and Procedures Committee, is actually listening, so I'm sure the thought will not be lost. Thank you very much. I'm wondering if I could just turn on then, since we've been through the generalities of that, to one of the other things that we have actually raised with the aforementioned Standards, Procedures and Public Appointments Committee, which is currently looking at the whole legislative process. Delegated powers memoranda do not at the moment have to include information specifically on delegated powers when they're not in subordinate legislation that's proposed. But of course we routinely ask you to give us the narrative on them. And so that does beg the obvious question of, could you not just supply it routinely first time round, please?
No, obviously that's something that you, I note your evidence to the SPPA committee, and I know that committee hasn't finished deliberating, but I think it's a point that I'm very sympathetic to. You know, if we're going to have to provide the information, then why don't we just do it routinely? It seems to make sense. So it's something that I am sympathetic to, but mindful of the fact that the committee has not concluded its deliberations and taking that forward. So.
Raised the point, and that's probably pretty much all there is to say on it. Thank you.
I think the one other point, I think from the report, there was some points about the quality of these, and I think what would be helpful to us in terms of improving that going forward, if the committee could suggest maybe a couple of times where we've particularly got it right and the memorandums have been just what you're after, because that will help us with the process of training officials to say, you know, this is the sort of thing that we're talking about, this is what the committee wants to see. So that would be helpful if that was.
Is us to find good examples as well as bad, and to be fair, they have been mentioned before, so I think we will be able to find them.
Okay,
thank you very much. John, a question?
Thank you, Chairman. Minister, you will be aware that the committee has had some difficulties scrutinising the delegated powers provision in bills between stages 2 and 3 due to the timescales involved. And in its submission to the SPPA committee inquiry, therefore, the committee expressed the view that it may be beneficial to extend the period between stages 2 and 3, and in turn the time before stage 3, by which a revised or supplementary delegated powers memorandum must be lodged. And of course we don't yet know the outcome of the SPPA committee inquiry. We'd be interested in the government's view on this proposal and what steps, if any, the government can take to address the committee's concerns on this matter. Very real concerns, I may say.
Yeah. Okay, I mean, I think obviously it's absolutely appropriate that the Parliament is reviewing its procedures to ensure that they remain fit for purpose, and the Scottish Government has already submitted our initial views to the committee's inquiry. I haven't yet had the opportunity to properly consider all the submissions that are in there, but the question of the gap between stage 2 and stage 3 is one where I think you make a good point, and there certainly was the instance of the Children and Young People's Bill where we accepted that the argument that you had made and moved the deadline for stage 3 so that you had more time. Obviously, the thing we have to remember, and maybe that from our side, that we need to instill in policy teams and ourselves for when we're scheduling, is that the timescales are the minimum timescales. And so we don't have to work to those, and we can work to longer timescales. So the standing orders as they are do allow for longer timescales, and I guess the challenge for us together is to try and proactively identify those circumstances so that we don't get to the point where we haven't provided enough time for you to do your job, which is an absolutely crucial job. So I think it's something that we certainly need to look at, and part of that job I think will be for us to look more carefully at the implications for this committee in scheduling stage 3, but also if you've identified an area where you think that you're probably going to need longer, then to give us the heads up on that as well, and hopefully then we won't get to the point that we potentially got to with children and young people, which we managed to resolve, of course.
Yes. I'm very grateful to you for that answer, I must say, and not wishing to labour the point, but perhaps reinforce it. I mean, the individuals, when there are a great number of amendments at stage 2, it's the collective impact of those amendments taken as a whole. Sometimes each individual amendment can be considered, but it's when you put them all together collectively, that's when I think our legal advisors can have a very real problem. Anyway, moving on to another question, I just say that new significant powers were introduced to the Public Bodies Joint Working Scotland Act at stage 3, and the timing of the lodging of those amendments meant that the committee was unable to consider the amendments until the day of stage 3. And furthermore, the lack of information provided with the amendments meant that the convener sought additional information from the Cabinet Secretary in the course of the debate on the amendment. Now, the committee considers that it could be helpful to allow for either a longer period between the deadline for amendments at stage 3 and stage 3 itself, or a gap between the consideration of the amendments at stage 3 and the vote on the bill itself. And pending the outcomes of the SPPA committee inquiry, what changes, if any, could the Scottish Government make in order to ensure that when new delegated powers are introduced to a bill at stage 3, the committee is made aware of the amendments as early as possible and is provided with as much accompanying information as possible?
On taking the last point first, I think it's absolutely reasonable that we should be providing you with information on new delegated powers at the earliest opportunity. However, my view is that wherever practical, we should not be bringing new delegated powers in at stage 3, and that is the message that I am putting out to policy teams, that the expectation is that there would, unless there's particular circumstances that makes it unavoidable, that new powers should not be introduced at stage 3. Where, for whatever reason, it is unavoidable that they are introduced, then absolutely this committee should be briefed as early as possible and given as much information as early as possible, so you can get advice from your legal advisors. I think the point is made, but my bottom line is that I would in most circumstances, not expect there to be new powers brought in at stage 3.
And just reverting back to timescales between amendments being introduced at stage 3 and the stage 3 vote itself, have you any views on that?
In terms of potentially separating the amendment stage of stage 3, and the standing orders do allow for that, and I guess it's something that we have to consider on a case-by-case basis. So the option is there to do it, and maybe the case that you've explained was one where we should have considered that. And I think there's a particular argument if new powers are brought in that are then voted in an amendment stage, then maybe there's an argument for us to. So it's certainly something that we need to consider more thoroughly.
I think we now turn briefly, please, to Mike.
Thank you, Good morning, Minister. As you're aware, changes were made to standing orders last year which altered the committee's remit to allow it to take the role of lead committee in scrutinising certain Scottish Law Commission bills. Can you give the committee any further information on the Scottish Government's plans for Scottish Law Commission bills? And does the Government currently have any plans to introduce any further Scottish Law Commission bills? And at what rate does the Government intend that the bills will be implemented?
First of all, I'm very pleased that the Parliament took the decision to put in place these new procedures. There was an argument that we were not paying, as a Parliament, not paying proper attention to the Scottish Law Commission's reports, and there wasn't a mechanism in place to take these forward on a regular basis. So I'm very pleased that we have the new procedures in place. I can inform that the committee that's subject to the Parliament's agreement that it meets the criteria laid down by the presiding officer's determination that the conclusions of contracts bill should be with this committee soon. Clearly, that's the first in this process, so it's important that that goes through successfully. It was very carefully selected as one that I think we're all pretty confident meets the criteria laid down for this procedure. Moving forward, though, I think we would expect there to be at least one of these every year. About one a year, I think, is the kind of rate that we would expect that these to be coming through. Obviously, we'll be working with the Scottish Law Commission to identify what the next bill would be, and we need to keep that process up. If we're, I think it's a good process. It's appropriate, and so we obviously need to get this one proceeding correctly, and as I say, I expect you to receive that first bill soon, and then we can continue to look at what the next bill will be, but I would expect probably about one bill a year.
That's fine, thank you. I'm conscious that Stuart Stevenson has another question.
I do. It's something that's come to my attention in the last week, where some interesting developments have had me seek out information. In particular, what I was interested in, and I hope this is something that can be raised in a perfectly proper way with David Mundell by the Minister, and what I'm about to say is not intended to be a criticism of anyone in relation to what I'm saying. I wanted to establish on what basis the Confederation of British Industry operated. So I went to Companies House and I discovered they're registered as a company, RC 000139. And Companies House says, company incorporated by Royal Charter, brackets England, oblique Wales, please contact the company directly as Royal Charter companies are not obliged to register any documents. So that wasn't very helpful.
Forgive me, can I stop you for two reasons? One, because I'm sure, genuinely, the Minister is not got more than a minute or two to give us.
Right.
Secondly, because its association with this committee is not yet obvious to me, but I'm not wanting to tread on your toes. And thirdly, because I'm absolutely sure the Minister is not going to have a good answer for you just at the moment, because he's not forewarned. So on that basis, I'm wondering, could you put this on paper? Could you send it to the Minister? Could we reflect on it at some later date?
If I may just say, I think it falls within the committee's purview in that since Royal Charters apply equally, in this particular case it's not a Scottish Royal Charter, they do apply in Scotland, given that this is not something that's subject to a legislative process, but creates in effect law of the land, I'm quite confident that it would come to this committee. And all I'm really after is I hope that the Minister might, in the next meeting with Mr Mundell, request that the 900 or so Royal Charters are somewhere publicly available, because currently it transpires they are not. Notwithstanding the fact that the Privy Council website, for whom they're responsible, says that the majority of the work is to do with Royal Charters. And it simply would be very helpful to understanding how the public good that is an essential part of a Royal Charter is actually auditable one way or another.
Right. Rena will consider the points made and identify who would be the appropriate minister to respond to, Mr.
I think that's fine, and I think I would also make the point, I suspect a little bit more detail would be helpful to the government in order to give you an even better response. I think probably that means that we've not overrun your time by more than about a minute. Minister John, sorry.
There was a sort of final question that we had sort of discussed as a committee last week, if I might just raise it with the Minister. And it's not intended to be a constitutional question, but in the absence of a revising chamber, would the Minister agree with me that the scrutiny of this committee is therefore perhaps even more important than it might be were we to have a revising chamber? And therefore, can you give us an assurance that the work of this committee is that the government takes cognizance of the work of this committee, I suppose?
Yeah, we absolutely do, and you know, I think going back to my original comments, I absolutely value the comments of this committee in helping us produce more robust instruments and to improve the clarity of legislation. I think, you know, in an ideal world, everything that comes from government would be perfect and you wouldn't have anything to do. But of course, we don't live in an ideal world, and while we continue to strive to improve the quality and robustness of what comes out of the government, will continue to have a very important role in that. And I see it as a partnership, and that's the way we'll continue to look at it. I think today's meeting has been helpful. To me, hopefully it's been helpful to you too, and maybe it's something that we should do on an annual basis, perhaps more close to when the annual report is produced.
I think that's a sentiment with which we'd absolutely agree. Thank you very much, Minister. It does give me the opportunity to thank you for coming, also to thank Steve McGregor, and to make the point on the record that he's the Legislation Programme Manager in the Parliament and Governments Division, and also to note that Paul Cathett is a Solicitor in the Scottish Government Legal Directorate, which I should have said at the beginning, and I'm sorry. Thank you very much for your evidence. We now move into private.